Welcome to the 14th video in a series looking at the impact of COVID-19 across the world. This video podcast is titled Precipice of Extinction and comes in two parts. Part 1, zoonotic diseases and how do viruses jump from animals to humans. Part 2, wet markets and wild markets. What is the difference? And how are they an essential component in the lives of millions? I am not alone in being concerned with the condition of our lifeboat. For years, scientists have warned that we are in the midst of a mass extinction, the sixth in the planet's history, and the first one caused by humans. Elephants could be gone from the wild within a generation, amphibian populations are collapsing, and the climate change is warming and acidifying the oceans, threatening to annihilate coral reefs. The global rate of species extinction is at least tens of hundreds of times higher than it has been on average over the past 10 million years. The main threat are shrinking habitats, the exploitations of natural resources, climate change and pollution. In a 2019 UN report, the UN states humans have altered 75% of Earth's land and 66% of marine ecosystems since the pre-industrial times. Changes that come in different forms, from waste dumping into oceans to human-introduced invasive species. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity recently set targets that almost a third of the Earth will need to be protected by 2030, and pollution cut by half to save our remaining wildlife, as we enter the planet's sixth era of mass extinction. Viruses lie around our environment all the time, just waiting for a host cell to come along. They can enter us through the eyes, the nose, the mouth, or breaks in the skin. Once inside, they find a host cell to infect. For example, cold and flu viruses will attack cells that line the respiratory or digestive tract. The COVID-19 virus attaches to the human ACE2 receptor. The protein provides the entry point for the coronavirus to hook into and infect a wide range of human cells. Regardless of the type of host cells, viruses basically follow the same basic steps to replicate. A virus particle attaches to a host cell. The virus releases its genetic instructions into the host cells. The injected genetic material recruits the host cell's enzymes. The enzymes makes parts for the new virus particles. The new particles assemble the parts into a new virus, and the new particles break free from the host cells. All viruses have some type of protein on the outside coat or envelope that fails or recognizes the proper host cells. This protein attaches to the virus to the membrane of the host cell. Some enveloped viruses can dissolve right through the cell membrane of the host because both the virus envelope and the cell membrane are made of lipids. Once inside the cell, the virus enzymes take over those enzymes of the host cell and begin making copies of the viral genetic instructions. And new viral proteins using the virus's genetic instructions and the cell's enzymes machinery make the new virus. The new copies of the viral genetic instructions are packaged inside the new protein. These are then coated to make the new virus. Once the new virus is made, they leave the host cells in one or two ways. They either break the host cell open, destroying the host cell. They pinch out from the cell membrane and break away with a piece of the cell membrane surrounding them. Once free from the host cell, the new virus can attack other cells because one virus can reproduce thousands of new viruses. Viral infections can spread then quickly throughout the body.
At a Maryland county fair in 2017, the prize pigs were not looking their best. Farmers reported feverish hogs with inflamed eyes and running snouts. But while fair officials worried about the pigs, the Maryland Department of Health was concerned about a group of sick fairgoers. Some had pet the pigs, while others had merely been near their barns. But soon, 40 of these attendees would be diagnosed with swine flu. More often than not, sick animals don't infect humans, but when they do, these cross-species infections, or viral host jumps, have the potential to produce deadly epidemics. So how can pathogens from one species infect another, and what makes host jumps so dangerous? Viruses are a type of organic parasite infecting nearly all forms of life. To survive and reproduce, they must move through 3 stages: contact with a susceptible host, infection and replication, and transmission to other individuals. As an example, let's look at human influenza. First, the flu virus encounters a new host and makes its way into their respiratory tract. This isn't so difficult, but to survive in this new body, the virus must mount a successful infection before it's caught and broken down by an immune response. To accomplish this task, viruses have evolved specific interactions with their host species. Human flu viruses are covered in proteins adapted to bind with matching receptors on human respiratory cells. Once inside a cell, the virus employs additional adaptations to hijack the host cell's reproductive machinery and replicate its own genetic material. Now, the virus only needs to suppress or evade the host's immune system long enough to replicate to sufficient levels and infect more cells. At this point, the flu can be passed on to its next victim via any transmission of infected bodily fluid. However, this simple sneeze also brings the virus in contact with pets, plants, or even your lunch. Viruses are constantly encountering new species and attempting to infect them. More often than not, this ends in failure. In most cases, the genetic dissimilarity between the two hosts is too great. For a virus adapted to infect humans, a lettuce cell would be a foreign and inhospitable landscape. But there are a staggering number of viruses circulating in the environment, all with the potential to encounter new hosts. And because viruses rapidly reproduce by the millions, they can quickly develop random mutations. Most mutations will have no effect or even prove detrimental, but a small proportion may enable the pathogen to better infect a new species. The odds of winning this destructive genetic lottery increase over time, or if the new species is closely related to the virus's usual host. For a virus adapted to another mammal, infecting a human might just take a few lucky mutations. And a virus adapted to chimpanzees, one of our closest genetic relatives, might barely require any changes at all. It takes more than time and genetic similarity for a host jump to be successful. Some viruses come equipped to easily infect a new host's cells, but are then unable to evade an immune response. Others might have a difficult time transmitting to new hosts. For example, they might make the host's blood contagious, but not their saliva. However, once a host jump reaches the transmission stage, the virus becomes much more dangerous. Now gestating within 2 hosts, the pathogen has twice the odds of mutating into a more successful virus. And each new host increases the potential for a full-blown epidemic. Virologists are constantly looking for mutations that might make viruses such as influenza more likely to jump. However, predicting the next potential epidemic is a major challenge. There's a huge diversity of viruses that we're only just beginning to uncover. Researchers are tirelessly studying the biology of these pathogens, and by monitoring populations to quickly identify new outbreaks, they can develop vaccines and containment protocols to stop these deadly diseases.
This new SARS-CoV-2, or COVID-19, outbreak represents the 3rd instance within the last 2 decades of the emergence of a highly infectious global threat. SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, once again has refocused the public's attention towards the detection and control of infectious viruses. Zoonotic viral outbreaks are arising more frequently as humankind and nature collide, often with greater intensity. About 60% of these new pathogens that we are seeing that have come out of the last 50 years or so, they derive from bodies of animals. About 70% of those derive from bodies of wild animals. And that's because people and wild animals are coming into novel, intimate contact that allows the microbes that live on their bodies to cross over into our bodies. Ebola, Zika, SARS, West Nile virus, these are a number of novel pathogens that have emerged in the past few decades that come from the bodies of animals. In 2017, Chinese scientists published the result of a 5-year longitudinal study into the role of horseshoe bats in the emergence of novel viruses. A large number of SARS-related coronaviruses have been detected in horseshoe bats since 2005 in different areas of China. They identified a cave inhabited by multiple species of horseshoe bats in Yunnan Province, China, near the city of Kunming. In addition, they reported the first discovery of bats, highly similar to human SARS-CoV virus, able to use the human ACE2 as the receptor, further exhibiting the close relationship between the strains in this cave and the SARS-CoV virus. This work provides new insights into the origin and evolution of the SARS-CoV virus and highlights the necessity of preparedness for future emergence. They actually warned the world of the possibility of viral spillover between the bats in this cave and the local population. Let's hear from the virus.
Dear humankind, thank you for being a superhost. I never imagined I'd have the opportunity to jump to a species as abundant as you. Most viruses only get to know their original host animal. Many exist entirely in the humid understory of a remote rainforest. We viruses are kept in check by healthy environments with diverse and abundant wildlife. But when you rip forests apart and capture billions of animals to feed your insatiable appetite for flesh and false cures, you bring viruses like me out of our natural quarantines. You introduce us to new hosts, like you. A superhost of 8 billion individuals and counting. A walking, flying, swimming human meat market. You make up 1/3 of all mammals on Earth by weight. The animals you grow to feed yourselves outweigh all the wild mammals and birds on the planet. As you drive our natural wildlife hosts to extinction, you throw us life rafts bigger than the Titanic. Why wouldn't I jump? As sinister as I may seem, it is not in my interest to wipe out my hosts. We all need other life to thrive. So if this sickness in your bodies opens your eyes to the deeper sickness in our shared planet, it will be to all our benefit. But my big question to you is this: am I enough? If apocalyptic fires aren't enough, if vanishing glaciers aren't enough, if super hurricanes aren't enough, is the cold shadow I cast across the lives of you and your loved ones enough for you to finally confront the prospect of your own extinction? Only you, humankind, can choose to be the cure to the deeper sickness. Only you can choose to nurture the ancient oceans, forests, and grasslands that nurture you, to bring back the chorus of birds and monkeys to silent rainforests, and to make wise choices every day in what you consume and how you live. By protecting nature in all its wild and wonderful forms, you protect yourselves. As the earth stops to take a collective deep breath, You have a rare opportunity to reimagine and redefine a new future. So tell me, what future do you choose?
In part 2, we discussed the role of wet markets and wild markets in the emergence of new novel viruses, but also the critical role that these markets have in the local populations. Across the political spectrum, there have been calls to outlaw, close down wet markets across the world.
It's extraordinary that the World Health Organization sees it fit for these wet markets to continue in China. They shouldn't.
The advice to China on the wet markets is close them, is it?
Yes, and it's advice to everywhere. You know, this is dangerous.
I think this is a big challenge for the world into the future. The World Health Organization and other international organisations, I think this is an area they can spend a bit of time and attention on, because we can clearly see the great risks to the health and well-being of the rest of the world. Food supplies and how they are provided to the public and how they're treated. These things can be very dangerous, as we've seen.
One, in terms of the origins of the virus, our best advice remains that it came from zoonotic or animal sources.
Of an archaic practice, and we call it cultural. We can use all sorts of baloney terms for it, but it's archaic, it's unhygienic, and it's wrong. And the world has been held to ransom by a practice that has allowed a disease to spread, that has economically brought the world to its knees and has caused a great degree of pain, suffering, and just heartache for so many people. And that can't happen again. And you want to know what? It will happen again, because the same practices that caused coronavirus to start are back out there again today as we speak, and someone has got to call it out.
Let's start off on this touchy issue of the wet markets, which, China most recently has actually hit back and said there's no kind of such thing as a defined wet market in China. They're food markets, they're vegetable markets, they're where people go and do their shopping. So in that sense, are they trying to redefine what was really the start of this public health crisis? Are they kind of trying to obfuscate the issue by saying essentially that these, wet markets that have wildlife elements to them don't exist?
Well, look, it may be lost in the translation, but the facts remain that rightfully the Chinese authorities reported to the World Health Organization and the World Organization for Animal Health that they believe the origins of COVID-19 came from what we call a wildlife wet market. And a wet market in Australia, and I'm sure in many parts of the world, is quite safe. It's where you have seafood, fresh vegetables. But what a wildlife wet market is, in our definition and many other nations, is where you are including natural wildlife and you're mixing them with domestic animals and humans. And in fact, that is where you create a situation where they intersect and where infection can be passed from wildlife onto domestic animals and into humans. And in fact, in our history, in the world's history, there's been 6 pandemics that have been traced back to wildlife wet markets. So we're not saying this is a point of confrontation. This is a point of responsibility. COVID-19 has proved to the globe that we've become a lot smaller. We interact, we're intertwined, our lives are intertwined. And so because we're a smaller community, a global community, we have to act as a global community and understand and see if we can mitigate those risks. And if they can't, well then we have to understand how do we isolate them from a traditional wet market that is very important, particularly in developing nations, in providing food security. So we're not trying to remove these markets at all. We're just looking at one element of them that needs to be looked at, and we're asking the World Organization for Animal Health, an eminent body, to use international experts to understand that. It's not just China. These markets exist in other nations around the world. And it's important to understand that this will help them as well, equip them and give them the tools to understand the risks that need to be mitigated in them. That's a responsible thing to do as the world's got smaller. We've got to look after one another and keep each other safe, but we've also got to make sure that we protect agricultural production systems that protect food security around the world.
The wild animal trade and live animal markets have been in the spotlight recently.
These animals, we don't know their history, We don't know what kind of pathogens or viruses that they are having.
After they were linked to the coronavirus outbreak, many celebrities, politicians, influencers, and members of the public have campaigned to close down live animal markets for good.
As long as people eat meat, there is going to be some risk of infection.
These celebrities want to see an end to wild animal markets and the wildlife trade for good.
Wet markets are very common and have a long history in many places in Asia and across all continents of the world. In many countries, wet markets provide an important outlet for small farmers to sell their produce. In a country like India or Indonesia, between 25 and 40 million people rely on wet markets and informal food vendors for their livelihoods. Animals and people are coming to new kinds of contact because of a variety of reasons, the biggest one being that we are essentially destroying so much wildlife habitat. What that means is a lot of animals are going extinct, but the ones that remain have to crowd into ever-tightening little patches of habitat that we leave for them. That's more frequently not in some distant intact forest. Instead, it's our farms and gardens in our towns and cities. Live animal markets are critical to providing food and livelihood for millions of people globally, and that authorities should focus on improving them rather than outlawing them, even though they can sometimes spark epidemics in humans. Reducing the risk of disease transmission from animals to human in these often overcrowded markets could be addressed in many cases by improving education, hygiene and food safety standards, including separating live animals from humans. The United Nations Biodiversity Chief recently stated, "The message we are getting is, if we don't care of nature, it will take care of us." It would be good to ban the live animal markets as China has done and some countries. But we should also remember they have communities, particularly from low-income rural areas, particularly in Africa, Asia and Central America, which are dependent on wild animals to sustain the livelihoods of millions of people. So unless we get alternatives for these communities, there might be a danger of opening up illegal trade in wild animals, which currently is already leading us to the brink of extinction for some species. She continued, "We need to look at how we balance that and really close the role of illegal trade in the future."
I think we should shut down those things right away. I mean, it boggles my mind how when we have so many diseases that emanate out of that unusual human-animal interface that we don't just shut it down. There are certain countries in which this is very commonplace. I would like to see the rest of the world really lean with a lot of pressure on those countries that have that, because what we're going through right now is a direct result of that.
When governments are hiding an outbreak from you in any way, that's where you're in danger. That's when the virus is actually winning.
Almost 50 years ago, the American political scientist Joseph Nye published an article, Multinationals, the Games and the Rules, Multinational Corporations and World Politics. Global businesses have learned to become more culturally aware as they have become larger. Even so, most modern economic developments would not have occurred without the multinationals that were all powerful 50 years ago, and then the new ones that have emerged since. Globalization is not the result of countries interacting with each other, but corporations. They drive the trade and investment flows that provide the fuel for economic growth. Perhaps the most significant modern economic change, the rise of China, as it emerged from behind its closed and protected walls, would not have happened without Western-based multinationals. They were the ones that invested in the People's Republic, used it as an export base, and opened it up to the world economy. Does that mean that multinationals, not governments, run the world? Combine even a few of these like-minded businesses and you are talking, if not of world governments by big corporations, but of an enormous concentration of potential power. When politicians rub shoulders with CEOs at the Davos World Economic Forum in the Swiss Alps each January, the question of which of them generally has their hands on the levers of power is a valid one. Recent commentary in the US has raised the question, is democracy failing? In my opinion, democracy isn't failing, it's evolving. It's evolving because individuals, groups are dissatisfied with the current status quo and failure of governments to act in the best interest of the population and the planet. But some aspects of capitalism in its current form is in trouble. We cannot follow the same narrative and expect a different outcome. There is a desire to return to normal. What is the new normal? Governments across the world have repeatedly said, we rely on science. We rely on science. Really? Scientists have been warning you for years that we need to change the way we impact the planet. Without change, we destroy the planet and ourselves. So what is the new normal? What do you see? Someone asked me the other day, when did it start going wrong in the United States? And before I could answer, another colleague answered, 2016. I couldn't agree more. I was stunned when America elected Trump to the presidency in 2016. In 2008, Trump was intent on building a luxury golf course in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. The local authority refused planning permission, only for the Scottish Government to overrule the local council. But Trump and the government banked on the tenacity of one individual, Michael Forbes. He was a farmer who owned some of the land that Trump needed to purchase to build the golf resort. Michael Forbes wasn't for moving. Despite years of intimidation and threats from Trump, thugs employed by Trump, and even the Scottish Government, Michael Forbes wasn't selling. Why? It was his bit of paradise, and no amount of money would sway Michael. Trump was defeated. In my second video podcast in this series, back in March, I mentioned that it was highly likely that civil disobedience would break out in the United States. But I was shocked at the trigger. I'm not going to debate the internal injustices within the United States and how these have been magnified under this president. But I am going to call out every other world leader who has silently sat on the sidelines while a deranged despot has dismantled every treaty and convention which protects the environment and attempting to slow and reverse climate change. Make America great again. Yes, Mr. President, you've made America great again. Except it's only you and your base that believe that. Similar to countries around the world, there have been protests in solidarity with the protests in the United States and drawn attention to the Black Lives Matter campaign. Australia is no different, with protests in Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne and potentially Sydney. It's interesting watching the various responses from the various state governments and federal government to the protests. The federal governments are advising individuals not to protest, using the COVID-19 virus as an excuse. The New South Wales government went to the Supreme Court and was granted an injunction making the protest illegal in New South Wales. I and you shouldn't be surprised at the stupidity of politicians who think they wield total power over populations. They don't, and individuals will march in solidarity. Or are they afraid that the lens will expose a soft underbelly of structural racism in Australia to the Indigenous Australians, or erosion of freedom of speech under this government? I'll remind everyone that recently journalists had their houses raided by the federal police, confiscating computers and phones. Why? Journalists were working on a story about war crimes committed by the Australian Defence Force in Afghanistan. Why? In Australia, the imprisonment rate for Indigenous people is 14 times higher than that of non-Indigenous people. In Western Australia, 1 in 13 Indigenous Australians are in prison. The AMA in 2019 reported that 600 children under the age of 14 years were in youth detention, and that 70% of that 600 are Indigenous Australians.